Hola, buen día.
Good morning. We're trying to start on time because we have a long session, a long morning session, a very interesting session with the first roundtable about gender and colonialism. I'm gonna keep it short because we have 90 minutes for this roundtable and we have 4 presenters. Teresa García Segura, Mayca de Castro, Carla Bauza, and Cielo Zaidenwerg. So, you will have 20 minutes for your presentations, and I'm gonna make a brief introduction to the round table. Yesterday, at the opening of the conference, we said that the project Rememchild, the exhibition, the catalog, has included colonial spaces. And we wanted to reflect that during the conference. And even if the project is very focused on war times in the 20th century, we understand that colonial spaces are spaces of violence and that we have a wider chronological look, as well as we look at a wider geographical spaces. I'm going to introduce Teresa Segura, who's going to talk about gender, maternity, and childhood at the Maratha royal space in the 19th century. To introduce Teresa, I would like to say that she has a tenure track on India at the Humanity Department at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. She has been a postdoctoral research at an education center in Delhi. She has been teaching at the M.S. Marian Tagore International Center of Advanced Studies. She has had also a grant at Juan de la Cierva Formation Fellowship. She's been a visiting professor at Brown University, at the American University in Beirut, and she has published Unexpected Biases in, among other works. So, Teresa, you've got the floor. Thanks, Celeste, for your presentation, for your introduction, and for making this possible. Let's have a look at the... I'm going to talk about the project, that it's a wider project. I have 20 minutes, and I'm going to try to do it in a way that everyone can understand. We very often don't remember that not the whole Indian territory was part of the British Empire, because you can see in yellow on the map, these were the Indian of the different kingdoms. The pink one was under British rule. We're talking about 500 and 600 states that were independent from British rule. Some of these states were small, other bigger, some were powerful, but they were all under some indirect British rule. And this imperial control was intensified in the middle of the 19th century, when British increased their control on the western part of India, this area from Gujarat, and the coast going down to Bombay and the southern tip. This western part of India that had many principalities had some of these principalities ruled by princes that were Marathas. Marathas was a political and ethnic group that came from the Maratha kingdom or the Maratha confederation that ruled this part of India in the 18th century. And in my research, I researched how a woman, Tanhi Bai, lives in this changing political scene where the rules have to face with the interference of the British rule. So the political and personal trajectory of Tanibai is changing all along when there are several political crises, and she becomes a key agent in the creation and resolution of political crises in a particular principality, which is the Principality of Baroda in the western part of India. And I'm going to focus on the fact how Tanibai uses motherhood, the biological motherhood and adoptive motherhood, and how she uses her children as key elements to trigger and solve political crises in this imperialist context that is increasing. The sources I'm using are mainly written British sources, written in English, and a biography of Tanibai that was written in Gujarati, and I've read the biography in English. I work with Hindi and Urdu, and Gujarati I have to read it, translate it into English. Tanibai was born in 1853 in the western part of India, in the presidency of Bombay. And she was born in the Asatara circle in the lower part in yellow. And Baroda, where she lived, in the end, is the circle in the upper part. She was born in a family that came from a Maratha clan. And when she was 13, Tanirai's mother took her from Satara to Baroda. And the visit was closely linked to the Maharaja of Baroda, the Prince of Baroda, who was Kandarao, the man you can see on to your left. Kandarao, at that moment, was almost 40. He had been married twice. The wives had died, and he had no children. So he was looking for a new wife, and through her the opportunity of having legitimate children who could take the throne of Baroda. Tanirai was introduced to the Maharaja of Baroda, and they got married. He was 30 years older than her. Kandarao and Tanibai got married, and 4 years later, Kandarao died suddenly without having had children. So the next in the line to rule was Malharao, who was the brother-in-law of Tanirai. The youngest brother of Tanirai was the next one in the succession line, and that was a problem for Tanibai. Malarao had been accused by his eldest brother of 2 attempts of killing, and when the brother died, had been imprisoned for 7 years because he had tried to kill his eldest brother. So Tanibai lost her husband when she was 17, so she was in a precarious situation. And the new prince of Baroda was her brother-in-law that did not like the former husband because had put him in prison. So Tanibai generates a succession crisis in Baroda, and because she says that she's pregnant. And some people are quite skeptical because they think that after 4 years of marriage they had no children. And Malarao is the first one to say that Tanibai was lying, that she was not pregnant. Months go by and Tanibai can prove that she's pregnant, and Malarao then accuses her of carrying a child that was not a legitimate child, that was not the child of his late brother. So the pregnancy of Tanibai makes that Malarao doesn't get to power, at least not until the child is born. In that principality, a woman cannot rule. So they have to wait until the child is born. If it's a man, it will be the next Maharaja of Baroda, and Malarao will not get to power. And if it's a daughter, yes, Malarao will get to power. The British rulers in Baroda have some suspicions concerning the pregnancy, but anyway, they are ready to support Tanibai until the baby is born. In July 1871, the baby is born, and it's a girl. So Malarao could become the next Maharaja of Baroda. And the British rulers in Baroda confirm in their communications that they are fully aware that there are other cases of aristocratic women in India that have used pregnancies as a way of generating a succession crisis. The baby girl is born, Maharao gets to power, so Tanibai decides to go to Pune, another city in India, in a self-imposed exile. Pune is not a city that she chooses like that without any reason. It was a knowledge center, it was an intellectual center, but it was at the same time a center for revolutionary and anti-colonial agitation and movements. So Tanibai sold her jewels and paid some agitators so they talked to British or gave information to the British, bad information about Malarao, her brother-in-law, and to carry out a misinformation campaign. And together with other things that British knew about Malarao, well, that took to the overthrow of Malarao, and he was sent to exile. So Tanibai went back to Baroda. And she asked the British to be able to exercise her functions as a widow, and so she could adopt a baby that could be the next Baroda's Maharaja, because she wanted to use motherhood to go back to power. The biological maternity could prevent for a while Malarao to get to power, and now adoption will allow her to rule through a regency, because she will be the ruler till this child is 18. She tells the British that she wants to adopt a child that has no connections with the Baroda court, that it's an outsider, a foreigner, to have more influence over the child. The British accept Tanibai's request to adopt a child that comes from outside the principality, because they think that they will be able to control what happens in Baroda, that was very powerful at that time in the India. Tanibai gets her way, so British present her with an adoptive boy. It's a child of 12, 13 years old when he was adopted. He comes from a foreign branch of Gaibat dynasty. He was a peasant, and he was illiterate and did not talk Gujarat and Urdu, which were the languages spoken there. So Tanibai adopts Sanijao, and after this private adoption ceremony, British call Tanibai, and they confirm her position as the head of the ruling family. It's not completely uncommon for women to get to the top of the ruling system in India. In the modern period and the beginning of the 19th century, there were a couple of cases of women that ruled Maratha principalities, Indore and Satra. But a woman being regent was quite uncommon. In this period, British take one of the main characteristics of 19th century queens, which was the education of princes that used to be in the hands of women. And British tried to separate Sayaji Rao from his mother and put a British tutor to educate him in a school outside the palace compound. Her biological daughter, Tarabai, and how the mother introduces her. The first time I saw the picture, I was surprised. I had never seen an Indian princess dressed like that. The dress is a masculine dress. It's not just a masculine outfit, but it's the outfit of a man, an intellectual one, well-trained. And I'm not going to describe it, but it's a masculine presentation that shows education. And Tanibai insists on presenting her daughter dressed as a man. And several British visitors in Baroda talk about that, how this little girl is dressed. And they say that Tarabai thought her daughter was a boy instead of being a girl. Tanibai's story is in many ways an exceptional story. In only 5 years, she becomes a widow, mother, adoptive motherhood, exile, and a return to power in Baroda. She was a privileged woman. She has privileges for her class, caste, and all these elements help her to go over the steps and become a catalyst for change in the Indian court in Baroda. Since the 80s, when Sayaji Rao gets to their majority and when she loses the power, she is marginalized. Her political and personal trajectory are useful to see how political crises that came from the European colonization transform or change the lives of Indian women. Very often they were marginalized, but in certain cases, like in Tanibai's cases, gave them the possibility to change things politically, to change their status and access to power, even if this change of status and political conditions were temporary.
No. Gracias, Teresa, porque...
Thank you, Teresa, because you used your time very, very well in your intervention. And it's been a very interesting presentation with a great deal of research work. I don't know if we will publish it as a book. You could sell the rights to a TV production company, because I mean, this world reminds me of an epic movie, a podcast, whatever. But something that could have a more general format. Well, let's go to the next presentation. Then we'll have time for a debate and to ask questions and also to all speakers. Now it's up to Carla Bauza. She will make a presentation entitled Women Slavery in the War of 10 Years in Cuba. To introduce Carla, she's a doctorate study in Cordoba. She is studying the African descent women history, and she got a degree in social anthropology at the University of Barcelona, and she got her master's degree at Pompeu Fabra University. She currently is finishing her PhD research in the Leipzig Institute for European History in Mainz, Germany. Carla, you have 20 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Celeste. I'd like to thank the organizers and Celeste Muñoz for organizing this panel. I'll make my presentation in Spanish. I prepared it this way. Well, I'm finishing my PhD thesis, which has to do with African women, Afro-descendants, both free as well as enslaved women in the first War of Independence in Cuba. I don't know, this happened between 1868 and 1878, and that's her other name, the War of the 10 years. And this war that did not finish with the independence was followed by the small war that only lasted 1 year and a half, between 1879 to 1890. Then we have a relative period of peace up until the beginning of the last War of Independence, very well known, from 1895 to 1898. It ended with the intervention of the US and the defeat of Spain. I am doing some research about the role of Afro-descendant women in this colonial war against the Spanish Empire during a period of time where slavery was still legal in Cuba. Slave trafficking became illegal, but slavery as an institution still continued existing in Cuba up until 1886, several years after finishing the first War of Independence. That's why I also speak about African women and Afro-descendant women, because some of them had been kidnapped in Africa and brought with the illegal traffic to Cuba. This meant a huge volume of slaves. In my work, I'm studying both the circumstances of colonial violence in which these women were imbued, and the colonial system, how it affected their lives during the development and evolution of war. And on the other hand, I am trying to see what degree of agency or what capacity of action they had to achieve their freedom and the freedom of their relatives. And also how in this colonial war they were related with the colonial insurgents, and what was the meaning of insurrection and how they became involved in it. The goal is to better understand what the relation is between gender, colonial war, and the variable of slavery, and in the forms on which women shaped up the world they lived in, and how they had an influence in the evolution of the first War of Independence. They had independence in mind, but also the abolition of slavery. As you probably know, Cuba was one of the last colonies of the Spanish Empire in the second half of the 19th century, and it was an economy and society based on slavery. Afro-descendant African population for the production of sugarcane. Cuba, after the Haitian Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century, Cuba turned into the main exporter of sugar in the world. But around this business, in the 19th century, there was an increase of demand of slave women for domestic work, mainly in the Havana city. They also worked in the sugarcane plantations. Slavery in Cuba would not be abolished up until 1886, but during the War of Independence, it served as a catalyzer for the slaves' emancipation, mainly because of the participation of slaves in the war. And also because this context incentivized a legislation and some decrees of abolition of slavery that gradually slaves used in their benefit. On the one hand, the self-proclaimed insurrect government decreed the abolition of slavery in order to increase their support from this part of the population. The 10th of October of 1868, which was when the Yara cry began, and it also coincided with the First War of Independence. This was led with a group of landowners, the Criollo landowners, descendants of people who had been born in Cuba, and who expressed their need and an interest of freeing the slaves that joined the armed insurrection and to become free from Spain. 1 year after, the Spanish government proclaimed a law called the Law of Free Bellies, which offered some opportunities to slaves to request their freedom if they could prove that their requisites were accepted, being over 60 years of age or newborns from slave women. These policies were not implemented for all the slaves, but actually these slaves had to exert some pressure so that these laws could be generated and get their freedom. It's true that the war was a context of tension between slavery and freedom. And in this context of violence that I'm trying to see, well, we have the element of the agency of women during the first days of the insurrection. Many of them escaped from slavery, from their owners, to join the insurrect forces that had been installed in the mountains, and surrounding mountains. And the repressive context was that when they were captured by the Spanish troops, they were systematically sent to slave deposits. And if they could prove that they were free, they would face a martial court, judged as rebels, and if they were slaves, well, we had to see who were the owners. If they were individuals who had to maintain their loyalty to the Spanish rule, well, then they were returned to their owners. If the owners had been part of insurrection, they all stayed in the slave deposits, and they were part of an embargo system. This embargo system, however, was implemented by the colonial government in order to put pressure and incentivize the support to insurrection. And also, many of the owners of the rebels, many of these slaves were part of this embargo system that limited the opportunities that women had to become free because they were excluded of armed fight. They were excluded from the struggle, and they were sent to new families, or families that were loyal. Afro-descendant women the insurrection took place in the east of Cuba, and they were sent to these prisons in Havana, or to the Pinos Island, which is in the southwest of Cuba, which currently is known as the Island of Youth. And they went there with their children. they were imprisoned there. This type of actions included maintenance for the community, these could be crimes that were called subversive voices when they expressed generally in public or in informal spaces. Well, so far so good. The context of the colonial violence, but the documents we have from the insurrected groups showed that women that were freed by these abolition decrees were considered free or liberato citizens, but they were still treated as home support staff or unpaid workers. And this, in practice, was a continuation of the slavist relationships. However, having said this, the declaration of abolition had an effect in mobilizing women that wanted to ask for their freedom. If they were free citizens, they were requesting in practice the fact of continuing with their freedom. This meant stop living with their own owners, freedom of movement, being close to their relatives and communities, being mothers without having to take care of the children of others while taking care of their own, and also being protected against sexual violence. In these organizations, there were groups that the self-proclaimed government in arms had established. On the other hand, this made us think and things differently how life was lived in their sphere of action, and the armed fights, how they were, something that has been covered by the military historians. I believe it's important to focus on the strategies to avoid repression and for survival. This was something nearly instinctive in wars. But if we focus on these activities of support and maintenance of life, etc., this reveals a world of planning. Women talked, they argued, they thought about strategies to ensure their future, their subsistence, and the subsistence of their families and communities in a context where they were perceived as agents of the rebels, and this meant being imprisoned, tortured, and deported. Survival was connected to different spaces and uses of these spaces, and it depended on the possibilities and conditions of these women. For example, if they were free, they had greater guarantees to survive and collaborate with the insurgency in towns and villages where they had lived for generations, probably, even if they were controlled by the Spanish military. For slaves who had escaped from their owners in the plantations they worked, well, they created new communities that had been formed by women, boys, and girls, and men that depended on them, that maybe were ill or wounded. These were autonomous communities or semi-autonomous communities that were based on a long-standing tradition of cimarronage. Cimarron is a term that was used to show these practices of resistance that used the slaves. In these cimarron or untamed or wild communities, they were in charge of taking care of, offering care to different people and developing their work of agriculture, of subsistence agriculture, an ephemeral type of agriculture to guarantee the survival of these communities while escaping from prosecution. They had informal networks of support, and they developed spiritual work, which has a lot to do with the cohesion of group and the building of links of and connections of solidarity. Well, this is, in general lines, what the insurgency could mean for them from their own perspective. But I wanted to speak about the end of the war, something that reveals the role of genders with respect to slavery and colonialism. The end of the fights came with an agreement between one sector of the insurgents and the government headed by Arsenio Martinez Campos. Maybe it rings a bell, the name. This agreement decreed well, it didn't reach any of the main goals, nor independence, and neither the abolition of slavery. But one of the concessions was that they freed 16,000 slaves, insurgent slaves, that had fought against the Spanish military during the war in order to de-incentivate a new uprising of the Afro-descendant population that had become 2/3 of the groups, the insurgent groups. But it's meaningful that in these groups of freed slaves in the Zanjón agreement, we didn't find any women, so freedom achieved was related by the use of weapons. But this had not avoided that during the war, women had been judged and condemned to being deported with their children, having molded the insurgency from these areas of influence, having also put pressure to be considered as free citizens in the insurgent group, not only in the theory but also in the practice. They had an active role. They didn't have a secondary role under the perspective of colonialism, neither from their insurgent activities during the war. They did not act. They did not simply follow men, their husbands, children, brothers, etc. in insurrection, but they were actually reclaiming their freedom, opportunities that this war context could offer them after the fact that slave men or free Afro-descendants that had been recruited for the armed fight. Well, in order to conclude, let me say that the women's slaves and the free, also Afro-descendant women, resisted in different ways during the war. That had begun as an insurrection led by a Criollo white elite. These women tried to find ways of escaping slavery in insurgency, and during this uncultivated or cimarron or untamed practices, where Spanish colonial authorities and also some rebel leaders imitated the emancipation of women while maintaining them in a condition of servilism, trying to control their mobility and their lives, forcing them towards domestic work and agricultural work. The way in which women fought in this context was mobilizing links in connections of solidarity among slave and farming communities, creating communities outside of the colonial control, and using their geographical local knowledge they had and the support of the communities that had participated, creating new resources and places where they could hide from the repression. And well, I'll stop here. I hope this was useful as a summary and that it was clear. But I would like to point out that it's also important to have this different perspective about the colonial wars, where women, in fact, had or played an active role. Though they have to do, well, a little more had to be done. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Carla, for sharing your research with us. And I'm sure that in the Q&A session we will be able to ask you questions and connect or link the different presentations, because we started with a story linked to the Indian aristocracy under colonial times. Now we went to a Cuban context with these stories of enslaved women in the framework of an insurrection, and now we're going to travel to Equatorial Guinea, and we're in the 20th century. We've got Mayca de Castro. She's going to talk about orphans, wife and children victims during the Spanish colonization in Equatorial Guinea. She has a degree in journalism by the University of Valencia in 2012. She did a master's in keys of the contemporary world at the University in Granada, and she holds a PhD in migration studies by the University of Granada. She has worked with intersectionality in the past in Equatorial Guinea, and she has interviewed equatorial women. So, thank you. I would like to say something. I cannot start this presentation without mentioning what's going on in Palestine, not just as a citizen that wants the international rule to be respected, but as a researcher. The Israel state uses the same colonial mechanisms that were used by Europe. Zionism is a colonial ideology to occupy Palestine, and if we legitimate it, we will be defending colonialism. Sorry, but I had to say that. And now I'm going to start with my presentation.
La he titulado...
The title is Orphans, Wives and Nuns, but this is not a way of defining women or the categories. These were colonial categories that tried to lock humanity into this colonial system. Looking at the Spanish colonial history is to look at the link between colonialism. There are many examples. Maybe the most obvious one is the two military dictatorships, that's Miguel Primo de Rivera and Francisco Franco, that created this idea of nation and national politics in the colonial space. But there are other links between nationalism and colonialism, focusing on Guinea. The Spanish state wanted to colonize these territories. On the one hand, they wanted to exploit resources, coffee, wood, and cocoa, that would allow the Spanish companies like the Vizcaya Bank or Carcellet to get richer, and the access of the Spanish population to several products, the cacao, cacao lat, chocolates El Gorriaga, that are in our memories and that show the link between nationalism and colonialism. So the second interest is maybe less obvious, is the role of colonialism in the Spanish imaginary in an identitary way. The Spanish colonialism in Africa throughout the 20th century, the protectorate of Morocco and Sahara, was fostered as a way to reestablish a sort of a national pride that had been won after losing the Philippines and Cuba. This is known as the disaster of 1898, and it has a national meaning, and this symbiosis between nationalism and colonialism explains that Africanism was defended by fascist military people, in anarchist intellectuals also. Equatorial Guinea has been the only territory with black population that has been colonized by Spain, and this allowed to defend the whiteness of Spain, facing a Europe that has never considered the south of Europe as never white enough. Africa starts in the Pyrenees. It's something that has been said, and African people who studied Africa supported this definition. I'm going to talk about the colonization of Equatorial Guinea. These are the territory, are very different, and each have different local communities with different habits, different languages. We have the continental part, the mainland. Here you can see on the square. It has a border with Cameroon and Gabon. We have the Bioko Island, which is the second largest territory. It's closest to Nigeria than to the mainland. We have the island of Andobon, who is further past Santo Tomé, and smaller islands, Garachico, amongst others. And as I said, each had a different community. In the mainland, the majority of people living are Fang. In the island are Bubis, and there were also Fernandinos, which were the Creole aristocracy, descendant from slaves that had been freed and that had arrived at a brief period of British colonization. These were the rich class when the Spanish came there, so they were considered people Spaniards could talk to. Spain and Portugal divided the territories, but the colonization took place at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th in the continental part. The communication I'm presenting focuses on the schooling in the mainland part and the schooling of girls. I've been doing the PhD on that topic. In 2017, I interviewed some Equatorian women, and I talk about them, about colonization. There were things that came up and up again. And one of the things was when they were in boarding schools run by nuns. And they kept mentioning a place that doesn't appear in history. It's called Sixa. This institution was mentioned by the women I interviewed, but it's not mentioned in colonial archives and has not been studied. And I've seen it written in these three different ways in different materials. So this lack of standardization when it comes to writing it shows that the vast majority of sources we can find are oral ones, and particularly women were the ones suffering in these institutions. What was Sixa? It was a department within the nuns' schools that was devoted to indoctrinate women to become Catholic wives. They said that they had to look after the husband, the family, the children, and girls that had not been married and had not studied in this particular department of the school. Girls that had gone through the colonial system. They were 12 years old, so Sixtas had a reproductive and productive goal to guarantee family relationship controlled by the colony and to instruct domestic work, cheap domestic work. I'm going to briefly talk about these schools that had this department called Sixa. The mission had the monopoly of education since the beginning, and Franco's government doubled the budget allowed to education run by religious people. These schools were the door to professionalization. They could go to further education on the island to become teachers or nurses. This system limited the access. There was an exam. They said that through this exam you could access to a grant, but there was no grant. The parents had to pay then for education, and the girls that had been admitted and the parents could not pay for the tuition, these girls only worked at the school, and they were called orphans. The schools were segregated racially. The daughters of colonists, of settlers, went there, but the Creoles were in another section. The women I interviewed said that they were poorly fed, whereas the white girls attending the schools got better food. For instance, olive oil, it had to be imported, was only given to white girls. In the schools, there are witnesses saying that there were abuses committed by priests against girls, as one of the interviewees mentioned. And child labor. In these schools, child labor was something normal to enrich the mission. The children will cook, clean, cut wood. All the children, non-white, work Saturday morning. And that's important because the mission had holdings. They were given land, they didn't have to pay taxes, and they were given workers for these pieces of land, for these holdings that were run by religious people. And the mission also used child labor to work in these holdings and as domestic servants, such as, for instance, to make the laundry of single white men or settlers. There were several companies that coincide with the headquarters on the island. This is a conversation in one of the interview, and the woman identified the big house, the school, and she said that the nuns got money in exchange of this child work. You've got 10 minutes. So, to go back to Sixa, it only existed in the schools of mainline, where the ethnic is Fang. We could see Enque, Nifang, Bata. On the map, we see Bata, Nifang near the border, and Enque is between Enfang and Nicomese, halfway through. So near the border. Two reasons that explain that, why Sixa was only on mainline. First, because of the border. At the beginning of the 20th century, many men escaped through Cameroon in order to avoid enslaved work that they were forced upon by Spaniards to build roads. And it was an area of political persecution where independent leaders were executed. Another reason why Sixa was only present on mainland is because it was the ethnic was Fang, and the cultural tradition was a threat for the colonial system. There was a commercial exchange between the Fang that went beyond the border, because we can find Fang in Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and Gabon. And the roles were very determined. Women were the ones in charge of the holdings. So men work in plantation, and women were the ones looking after the house. In order to change the roles, the mission launched a campaign that involved the Sixa. So the Catholic marriage was something required to move up in society. There was an institution that classified racially the population and controlled the access to land. So if the Catholic marriage could lead to have access to land, so people indebted themselves to get married in a Catholic way. If a man wanted to look better, he went to Sixa to look for a wife. So Sixas appear mainly in the continent. But why did the government wanted to control this area and build roads? Well, because it's important to control the border, and the Fang forest, which is this area share between Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, has wood. For instance, in the 50s and the 60s, the train tracks in Spain were built with wood from Equatorial Guinea. The wood of Okume was sent also to Germany, and it seems it was part of the payment of the Franco's regime in exchange for the bombing of Guernica. Izaguirre was the company that exploited the wood, and this company was in Spain, controlled by the Vizcaya Bank. There was a sixa in the missionary complex of Unque. This area started to be colonized at the beginning of the 20th century through what was called punishment missions to intimidate and avoid people fleeing through the border, particularly populations around the border. People still remember the exemplary punishment performed by militaries, which was basically killings, public killings. The women with whom I talk explain histories. Casilda was a teacher, and we started talking with several women, and they shared this information that you can see in the screen. A story that her father told her, a population that refused to send letters on foot, and they did not want to do it, and they were punished. Missionaries went to Equatorial Guinea, and the colonization was different from Latin America. Here, the military power was used. The missionaries settled down in Enque. And here there is the witness of one of them, in which he said that the territory was cleaned. He arrived in 1817, and he was part of these punishment missions. And he said that thanks to the military men that had cleaned the territory, these missionary people could perform their duties. The missionary numbers increased, and an orphanage was open. And in that school, the first sixa was open or set up. In 1845, a center for people with leprosy could go. And according to one of the witnesses, around this leprosy, people that die of the disease are buried, as well as people that were in favor of the independence. The first school was called School Orphanage, and the school of Enque was called Orphanage, and that was a euphemism, because at the beginning a common practice was to kidnap girls and to send them to that school. And this practice took place also on the island of Bioko. And I thought it is important to point out that there is a colonial symbolism around this figure of an orphan girl. And remember that the girls whose parents could not pay for the school were also called orphans, because orphans had this idea of acculturation, the substitution of the parents by colonial agents. So the colony was killing the parents because the system was converting this local population into people that were minors and needed some tutoring. Then what did happen with these girls that were minors? During Franco time, the school orphanage and the leprosies were fostered as some action by the Spanish government for the benefit of people, but the intention was to control the most vulnerable people in the population, girls, people with disabilities. Here, on the one hand, we have the colonial system, and we can see also some women that wanted to go to sixa because it was a way to avoid a fang marriage or wedding. And in fact, fact, some chiefs of the Fang clan or community were accusing Sixa of stealing women from the Fang clan. This Catholic indoctrination was linked with the colonial system, but could also be an opportunity to escape from the hard life that imposed by the local tradition.
Anastasia, in this quote, Anastasia is a known Guinean feminist. Speaks about the Fang tradition. Speaks about women as a property. Many of these women saw becoming a nun a way to escape to marriage, and nuns. Nuns said that they were widows, so the marriage was avoided. One of the women I interviewed said that she wanted to be a nun, and she threatened to commit suicide. And this there was a girl of the same white priest that generated her vocation, married her against her will. To finish, I believe that the case of the Sixas is a clear example of that. Women were a historical subject that will expand the understanding of the past. The productive and care dimension helps us better understand how the production relations existed. This opens up the possibility to study other stories having to do with leading institutions, etc., while covering elements that help us understand history as a process of social relations and imaginary situations. Thank you. Thank you, Mayca, for bringing your research. I have lots of questions to ask you. I don't know if I'll be able to ask them all. And thank you for reminding us that, understanding situations of the past helps us understand things that happen in the present, for example, in Palestine. We'll now travel to the other side of the Atlantic and we'll go to Argentina. To do that, Peter Zaidenwerg brings a presentation entitled Resisting Coloniality from the Margins, Communist Militancy Women in Argentinian Patagonia. Let me introduce her by saying that she's a doctor in history from the University of Barcelona and being part of the Institute of Latin American Studies in Columbia University. Currently, Cielo is part of the interdisciplinary group FINAP at the University of Barcelona, where she teaches, and she's also a member of the Institute of Research of Gender Studies from the University of Buenos Aires. So, Cielo, you have the floor. Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, and particularly Celeste, for the kind invitation to this panel. I think that, it is very interesting. It's a real pleasure to see how you intertwine these stories and these experiences, transnational experiences actually. I will try to use this opportunity of being here in a public sphere to thank and say that in research projects like the one I'm presenting here today, or in my teaching practice, I think and defend education and public education, where I was training my country, Argentina, but also in my hosting country, which is Catalonia, while creating. This is obvious, of course, I know, but it's not so obvious if you don't say it, and we have to re-vindicate it. Let me share with you the last research I've been doing. What is it about, and what is the contribution to generate some food for thought transnationally and transdisciplinarily? I will read a brief event. I will read it for you. 14 September. Maybe you can help me with the slides. September 14, 1943, Amelia Garcia was arrested in Maya Blanca in the south of the province of Buenos Aires after a few days of an intense police prosecution process, accused of being a promoter of social compulsion processes and therefore of being a danger for the community. This woman, 41 years old, had been able to escape from police for the last 2 months. When the order of capturing her was issued, she went to the south of Argentina, in the Patagonia. She knew the lower valley of Rio Negro, and where she developed her political activities. She knew the area, the climate, and the inhabitants. She knew about their happiness and their sadness, and how hard it was to survive there. For a long time, she had traveled the south in this place, promoting the proposals of the Communist Party, political organization she belonged to. And that since the 1930s, in the framework of the economic crisis, she had been able to expand her presence in Patagonia, in spite of the legal repression and paralegal repression, supported by the possibility of undertaking trips from town to town. She decided to move around the area up until the springtime of 1943. From there on, the winds stopped blowing in her favor and became headwinds. When she was captured, she screamed, "Hail the Communist Party," trying to show the power of her conviction to whoever was listening to her, the uniformed soldiers or those people that were curious in the area and were looking. Amelia stayed 1 year and 2 months in jail, being tortured and in jail. They were trying to break her. Her health was compromised, and finally, the 4th of December of 1944, her detention was eliminated, and she had to sign a sworn declaration where she rejected to continue her activity, her communist activity in the region, and she signed. But obviously, Amelia did not follow that situation. Inspired in Amelia or Marta Roca or Lucy or La Pasionaria, we studied the communist militancy in the marginal areas of our country in the 1930s and 1940s, the 20th century, in the center and southern part of Argentina, among women in the area of Patagonia. I will show you some maps, this one in particular to describe that escape to clandestinity of Amelia. But particularly, I am interested to show these workers, women, who developed strategy to question and oppose to the oppressive machinery of the national state, and therefore here we will be talking about an internal colonialism in an independent national state, but also against the hegemony of the capitalist system in the world. In a nutshell, just to give you a framework of reference to this research, what we do is to study dynamic of emancipation that take place in the periphery of the periphery, in a global sense of history. Let me just contextualize this. Maybe you could help me. Why is it important to focus on these margins, particularly in the Patagonia? Patagonia was considered a peripheral region, and even if it may seem problematic, the peripheral category, this category is thought as a region, a wide and big region with restricted political rights. Their inhabitants could not vote their representatives, and they depended on the executive powers. Therefore, they were considered as second-class citizens. In the case of women, they couldn't even vote in the municipal elections. Therefore, this concept of periphery has a lot to do with marking an internal colonialism or coloniality. Why do we say the periphery of the periphery? Well, because Argentina falls into the world capitalistic system, also with rationales that are subordinated by their condition of a primary export country. In that respect, therefore, we believe that we contextualize the periphery of the periphery in this case. Well, to tell you the truth is that Argentina was built as a nation state that will reproduce systems of internal coloniality in different areas, amongst which we have Patagonia, and therefore Patagonia will really depend on the will of the economic and political elites of Buenos Aires. Why was it necessary to restrict the rights while keeping this region in the political and economic marginality? Well, because this is considered a dangerous land to be conquered, to be tamed in order to avoid both internal menaces from left-wing sectors as well as the original communities, and also menaces coming from surrounding countries or foreign powers. With respect to this period, we know that this period had great changes internationally. In the case of Latin America, at the beginning of the decade of the 1930s, we could see these people were suffering the backlashes of the big depression. That would also generate an important recession, economic recession, and in the case of Argentina, a rise of the right-wing powers. 1930 was having the first coup d'etat in the 20th century in Argentina, and this used martial law, the state of siege, to the restatement of the death penalty, as well as espionage, prosecution, torture, imprisonment, and deportation of workers, activists. Well, you name all the terrible things that you can imagine in the context of Patagonia and in the case that we are dealing with in the north area of the Patagonia. In the second coup d'etat of the 20th century, in 1943, there was an increase of the prosecution of the left-wing workers, and there was an imprisonment of different subjects, different militants, different people. There is where we decided to work in talking about the source of it all. Let's go to our subjects in this case. Subjects of interest, in this case, to continue with the fight and resistance experiences of Familia and other communist militants in the North Patagonia. We've been working through several different sources. Some of them are more personal, others are more institutional. Shall we go to the next slide? We continued our research with a personal diary, which is the personal diary of Amelia Garcia, which came to us via an act of faith, maybe we should say, when we go to the archives and we look for sources. But in this case, believe me, I swear, I wasn't looking for her. This diary came to me. These are the magic things that sometimes happen. Sometimes we have the privilege of witnessing these situations, these magic situations. In her personal diary, well, we could make a history about this diary, the object actually, because it's not the diary, the physical diary. If you observe... Oops, I'm sorry, something happened with the microphone. Okay, well, these are pictures of the diary. I'm not going to expand this information. You'll have to wait till you read the article. But these photographies of the diary belonged to a commissary of the area, the diary of a communist militant in the hands all the policemen that had been the government of the region of Rio Negro, and when he passed away, the family donated many books, amongst which we had the diary of this communist militant. It had no name. She has not mentioned it there. Here we could make an analysis, a full analysis of the object. I'm not going to keep this. I will say that yes, that the diary at the beginning, when we began reading it, seemed to be a piece of literature, because what Amelia wrote is incredible. So much so that I told Cel that when you fall in love with a subject, the historical subject, things happen. If you read it, you will be totally hooked. Amelia had been born in Carmen de Patagones, a town. I don't know if you can see it in the map. Carmen de Patagones, right in front of you have the city of Viedma. Two separate political towns. One belongs to the province of Buenos Aires, Viedma belongs to Patagonia, Rio Negro. But she will act as the binomial. Viedma is the capital of the Rio Negro territory, and for Carmen de Patagones, this was the capital, which was the federal, the de facto capital, because the real fact was that the capital was hundreds of kilometers away. Well, Amelia was a teacher, one of the first ones that got a degree in the normal secondary school of Patagonia. And she sympathized with the Communist Party since she was young, and in 1938 she undertook a more committed set of activities, and she was appointed secretary of the Communist Party in Carmen de Patagonia, and acting in the area of Rio Negro. Beyond personal details we can find in this diary, she made reference to the conditions of life in the fields, to strategies that were developed by her and her colleagues in their political activities, and in the awareness raising of things. She went to the different towns, she looked at the life conditions, what were the needs, and from there on she proposed solutions. I was going to read some of the passages, not just to give a voice to Amelia, but to give her some action. She wrote this diary at a very important moment of her political life, also when she escaped to clandestinity. In any case, I'm not going to read it all because we'll run out of time. But this diary proves that she is a fantastic reader of all that is happening, all the news that are coming. For example, about this Second War on, or the conditions of in the Central Communist Party in the Soviet Union of the time. And she also wrote to those people, to those farm workers that she will, little by little affiliate into the party. And in Patagonia, information, Patagonia, such a wide region, information was key. Amelia was doing a job of informing people about the labor rights and social rights that these workers, field workers, had. So she was called passionary, because she had a passion, a power of conviction that was incredible. Next slide, please. Now I will read these two quotes that she made in her diary. June 24, 1943, she said, "I'm making progress. Today I was arrested. I am a political criminal. What an honor. I am a communist. Long live Stalin." And she said, "Don't shrink. It's worth more than a don't get involved. And it's more local, more Creole." well, police records include files and records when when someone was arrested, included some information. And then I thought July 23, 1943, she realized that there are two police cars in front of her house. And the day after, she decided to escape to clandestinity, helped by her comrades that will hide her from ranch to ranch. July 23, she flees into hiding. She began the razzias, trying to find new militants. She continued writing her diary in clandestinity, and she realized about these razzias, about these raids. And she said, I realized that all my comrades were victims of the razzia, my comrades, but they went back to freedom, at least my colleague, except for my buddy. He's being held hostage until I surrender. The Gestapo is in action. Can we go to the next slide? That comrade is Jose Filippini, a merchant of the Patagonia's area. She was taken to prison. Here we have the file, the record. If there is an institution in the area that includes all details, all and each one of the activities, physical conditions of the prisoners, that's the police. And therefore, I am very thankful about these documents. But it's a source that really needs a deep analysis, because obviously we have the voice of the repressor, but we will also find in this analysis the voice of those that were accused.
It's 1943, and we can see all these police records. In the police record of Jose Filippini, the colleague or the partner of the secretary of the Communist Party, he's described as a victim of his wife. He came from a well-off family, so he was not a social threat, and the social threat was in fact his wife. The burden of the law fell upon Amelia, aware that her practice was not the practice of a tamed woman. She was described as an activist that has deeply ingrained the communist ideas and the work for the Communist Party, that she represented a social threat. So Amelia was dangerous because she was a communist and she had her communist activities, and she was questioning the central power, and also because she was not respecting the manpower in the house and in the community. So she represented this social danger or threat. We can look at this, we look at the police records, and I'm going to mention three things. Three things I'm going to mention. Despite the fact that Amelia was here the protagonist, but she was not an exception. This idea of strong women were not an exception. We cannot think that Amelia was an exception. In fact, Amelia shared her ideas with other activists, men and women. Tomasa Miranda, for instance, she was secretary also of the Communist Party in Misha Regina. She has been reported by her neighbors. Or Ida Susanovsky, that has been arrested for having published an article in the paper defending the Russian school model. Or Sephora Sarai, Brone Baginis. They were young women affiliated to the Communist Party, and they were like daughters for Amelia and Jose. These two young women came from poor families, and Amelia and Jose had protected them, had given them a house and education. They were arrested and accused with selling communist press. And Amelia said, yes, but it's a voluntary action. And Amelia was accused of corrupting these young women. This activism of women at the margins did not mean that they were marginalized women, despite the political situation. They had power and right, sometimes with the support of the colleagues and sometimes without the support. But they had the capacity for agency. It's not the same in the fringes or the marginalization. They created political solidarity links and also human links. And I'm going to conclude by saying that the history of these women help us to rethink about the representation of the hostile Patagonia, a desertic one, isolated from the world. No, it's not this idea. These women on the fringes show us this other side of Patagonia. And that's it. Thank you.
Solo te has pasado.
Okay, you went only 1 minute over time, so you respected the time you had been given. Thank you, Cielo, for your presentation. It's a pity because we will have 5 minutes for the Q&A session. I think the trip this morning has been fascinating. We could hear different women's histories throughout different geographical spaces and time. I would have many questions to ask you, but I think I'm going to let the audience to ask questions and try to respect the 5 or 6 minutes we have for the Q&A session. We have a coffee break after the session, and then we will have the closing keynote speech.
Hola.
Congratulations, because it's been fantastic. I have 2 short questions. One is because I don't know about the subject for Teresa. At that moment, Sati was still in India, and why it was not implemented. And for Carla, some of the women you mentioned ended up deported to Fernando Po, as some other people ended up. Some other questions? I would like to ask a question to Mayca. For the etymology of sixa, from what I've read, it comes from sister. It's a deformation of English, or we don't know the etymology of sixa. We apologize, we cannot translate because the presenter is not using the microphone. Yes, there is the oral tradition of Guinea. And in fact, in my PhD, I write it with a C. And then I looked into the archive. I saw Sixa written with a J. But Melibea, who is a writer from Equatorial Guinea, she writes it with an X, Sixa, in her novel. So there is no standardization when it comes to writing Sixa, and it's fantastic because it shows that it's based on oral witnesses and it's not part of the written history, and it's not standardized. I would like to the 4 presenters about the process when you have to choose the research methods, or when you have to choose objects, social classes that change a lot at the time, access to literature, access to women's voices. Can you describe the process to choose the methods you're going to use in your research? First, the question about sati, this suicide of the widow when the husband dies. Sati had always been a limited practice in colonial India, and it happens mainly in communities that are not the community this woman was part of. Maratha, she was a Maratha, and from an ethnical point of view are different from the communities where the sati was practiced in colonial India. Concerning the other question, sources, that's a delicate issue, and probably you will share this with me. I agree with Cielo. She was saying to read the sources with a critical eye. Women sometimes we cannot find them in the archive, so we need to know how to read this silence or absence. And I'm going to leave it here so my colleagues have time to answer also the question. I would say the same. Sources in the history of Equatorial Guinea come from the Colonial Archive, which belongs to the Spanish administration, and it's an archive very male-centered. We have to read the archive with a critical look and also ask questions to history and take into account the power relationship. And also, it depends also on the questions we ask the history. And oral sources in Equatorial Guinea, it's very difficult right now to access to these oral sources. Obiang is the longest living dictator, and Equatorial Guinea has had 2 dictatorships since they went independent from Spain. So I think that we all shared more or less the same situation. Yeah. I'll answer the first question about Fernando Po. No, I haven't found cases of deportation to Fernando Po, deportation of women. It was a deportation of men. Albert Sagaraña has worked on the Guerra Chiquita, small war, where women were deported and slaves were deported to Chafarinas and Baleares. Concerning the sources, I work with military cases or documents mainly, and women's voices are not there, but they are taken for questioning, and you can think or guess what was going on. And it's very useful also to compare it with other witnesses, because they tend to ask many people about something that had happened. So comparing different versions, I think you can have more information and have an idea of what happened. I agree with the difficulty of finding these female voices in the sources, but if we look carefully, they are always there. And the second question was, what questions do we ask the sources we use? And it happened to me. Doing my PhD, I saw these sources, and I went back to the sources later, and I asked different questions, and many doors open up. Sometimes the sources are not complete. We take a little bit from here, a little bit from there. And I think it's very important how we relate one source to another. To find female voices within the institutional narrative. But I think, I don't know if you're doing your PhD, but I think we don't have to be afraid of fragmentation. Some historians, if they don't have complete sources, they don't start the research. I think we don't have to be afraid of fragmentation and have lots of imagination. I would like to ask something that is very important in the history of Equatorial Guinea. Literature as a source is very important. In the 80s, after the independence, and Matthias, there was an explosion of writers of literature in Equatorial Guinea. They wrote novels, and they also wrote historical novels. And I showed you in the end Maria Ansue, which was the first woman to publish a novel. So literature is very important because it's written by locals, and it offers a point of view that can be completely the opposite one or not. And through fiction, we can maybe complete the gaps that generates our research, or that we cannot if we cannot find the information in the archive. So it's very interesting to use these literary sources in our research. I'm very sorry, but we have to put an end to the round table, and I would invite all of you to have a coffee and come back at 12:30 sharp for the conference by José Manuel Núñez Seixas. Thank you very much to our presenters, and thanks to the audience for being here.